The San Francisco skyline stretched across the horizon, glass towers reflecting the golden hues of the early morning sun. Down below, in the heart of the city, Sterling Enterprises stood like a fortress of steel and power. Inside, Alice Carter tightened her grip on her coffee cup, her heart pounding as she stepped into the lobby. Today was the first day of the rest of her life. She had fought tooth and nail to land this job. Sterling Enterprises wasn't just any company. It was the company. A global powerhouse, a stepping stone to success, and more importantly, a place where she could finally prove herself. But fate had other plans. The moment Alice stepped onto the executive floor, chaos erupted. "The system's down," someone shouted. "We've lost access to all files. I can't even log in. This is a disaster." Employees were running from desk to desk, frantically typing on dead keyboards, shaking their screens in frustration. Phones were ringing off the hook. Alice's stomach dropped. This was not the smooth, impressive first day she had envisioned. She glanced around, scanning the room for an IT technician. Someone, anyone, who could fix this mess before the entire office collapsed into madness. And then she spotted him. A tall, well-dressed man in a tailored suit stood near the entrance, watching the chaos unfold with an unreadable expression. He looked calm. Too calm. Alice didn't have time to wonder why. She marched straight up to him, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "You took way too long," she snapped. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback. "Excuse me? No time for chit-chat, buddy. The system is down and everything is a mess. Fix it now." The man tilted his head slightly, amused. "And if I told you I can't?" Alice let out a loud sigh. "Oh, fantastic. First day, and they send me a useless IT guy." There was a moment of silence, and then he laughed, a low, infuriatingly amused chuckle. Alice narrowed her eyes. "What's so funny?" "You," he said simply, grinning. Alice stomped her foot. "This is not funny. If we don't get this fixed, I'll be fired before I even find out where the bathroom is." The man shrugged. "Then I guess you better figure out where it is first." Alice's patience snapped. "Okay, enough. Sit down. Work your magic." She grabbed him by the arm and pushed him toward a desk. The man sighed theatrically, adjusting his suit before sitting down in front of the computer. Alice hovered over him. "Faster. Patience. You need to be faster. This isn't an IT class for retirees." The man stopped typing and turned to her. "Am I really being told how to do my job by you?" "Yes. It's just a computer. Click, fix, done." He shook his head, muttering, "Unbelievable." Alice grabbed the phone. "Hello, security? I have an IT guy here who... Try pressing this." He tapped a single key, and suddenly, every screen in the office lit up. A collective gasp of relief swept through the floor. Alice blinked. Wait, that was it? The man stood up, adjusting his cufflinks casually. That was it. Alice let out a sigh of relief. Finally. Now you can go to the next floor and fix theirs too. The man raised an eyebrow, his smile growing. And who said I work here? Alice froze. The words hung in the air for a few unbearable seconds. Then, a voice shattered the silence. A nervous, hurried voice, belonging to a man in a gray suit. Sir, everyone is waiting for you in the board meeting. Alice's heart stopped. Sir? Board meeting? She turned back to the IT guy she had just yelled at. And that's when it hit her. Ethan Sterling, Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Enterprises. The man she had just dragged to a desk and ordered around like an intern was her boss. A deadly, deafening silence spread across the office. Ethan crossed his arms, amusement flickering in his piercing blue eyes. So, Miss Carter, he said, his voice laced with mocking curiosity. "Any more orders for me? Or are you satisfied now?" Alice felt the world crumble around her. Her face burned, her hands turned clammy, and her mind screamed in neon letters, "I'm fired." The silence in the office was deafening. Alice Carter stood frozen in place, her stomach twisting into 1,000 knots. The realization that she had just ordered Ethan Sterling, CEO of Sterling Enterprises, to fix a computer like an IT intern was sinking in at a painfully slow pace. Her brain scrambled for a way out, a way to explain herself. But then Ethan's smirk deepened. "Miss Carter, you seem awfully quiet all of a sudden. Cat got your tongue?" A soft murmur rippled through the office. Employees exchanged wide-eyed glances, some covering their mouths to hide smirks, others looking at Alice as if she had just signed her own termination papers. Alice's pulse pounded in her ears. "Think, think, think." "Sir, she started, her voice cracking. Ethan arched a brow, his amusement almost infuriating. What? "We're just doing your job," he said smoothly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Alice gulped. She could already picture the security guards marching her out of the building, her career crumbling before it even started. She squared her shoulders, summoning whatever dignity she had left. "Sir, I sincerely apologize for—" Ethan held up a hand. "No need for apologies, Miss Carter." Alice blinked. Wait. Was he letting her off the hook? But before she could even process what was happening, Ethan turned to the assembled staff and raised his voice just enough for everyone to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, let this be a lesson to all of you. Never assume. Because when you assume, well, you all just witnessed what happens." A ripple of awkward laughter swept through the room. Alice felt her stomach drop further. This wasn't letting her off the hook. This was public humiliation. And it wasn't over. Ethan clasped his hands behind his back and took a leisurely step toward her, studying her like she was some kind of interesting puzzle. "Since you seem to be an expert at taking charge in a crisis, Miss Carter," he mused, "why don't you explain to the entire board of directors what caused the system crash?" Alice's blood ran cold. The board of directors, the most powerful people in the company. She had barely figured out where the coffee machine was, and now she was supposed to present to the board. She started, her voice failing her. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "Time's ticking, Miss Carter." Alice's mind raced. This wasn't just some random punishment. This was a test. He was seeing what she was made of. And Alice refused to crumble. She took a deep breath, steadied herself, and forced her brain to work at full capacity. "I believe," she said, keeping her voice firm, "that the system crash was caused by an overload in our cloud synchronization process. Too many large data transfers happening at once, without a proper load balancing system in place." The room went silent. Ethan tilted his head slightly, intrigued. "Go on." Alice's confidence grew. "If I had to guess, our servers were processing multiple priority uploads simultaneously, which led to a bottleneck effect, ultimately causing the system to freeze up." Ethan studied her for a long moment, as if analyzing every syllable she had just spoken. Then he smirked. "Well," he said, clapping his hands once, "looks like we've just found our new resident IT specialist." Laughter rippled through the office again. Alice wanted to crawl into a hole and never come out. But instead of firing her on the spot, Ethan turned and walked away, leaving Alice standing there, humiliated yet oddly relieved. Maybe she had just survived, or so she thought. Alice sat on the edge of a leather chair, trying to keep her hands from shaking. She had been summoned to Ethan Sterling's office, which, in her mind, was basically the corporate version of a courtroom before sentencing. Ethan sat behind his massive glass desk, skimming through a file, looking completely unbothered. "So," he said casually, flipping a page, "do you always go around barking orders at random men in suits?" Alice pressed her lips together, her face heating up. "No, sir," Ethan smirked. "That's a shame. I rather enjoyed the experience." Alice stiffened. "If you're about to fire me, just get it over with." Ethan finally looked up. His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers, unreadable. "Fire you?" He let out a low chuckle. "No, Miss Carter. I'm promoting you." Alice froze. Her brain short-circuited. "Promoting me?" she repeated like an idiot. Ethan leaned back in his chair, interlocking his fingers. "You handled an impossible situation. You thought on your feet. You didn't crumble under pressure. That's exactly the kind of person I need in my office." Alice's jaw nearly hit the floor. "You want me to be your assistant?" she asked in disbelief. Ethan smirked. "Well, you seem to already enjoy giving me orders, so why not make it official?" Alice stared at him, trying to find the hidden cameras, convinced she was being pranked. This doesn't make any sense," she stammered. Ethan shrugged. "It doesn't have to." Alice opened her mouth to argue, but before she could, the office door swung open. Richard Blake, Ethan's longtime assistant, walked in. A gray-haired man in his 50s, with an expression that screamed skepticism. "Sir," Richard said, eyeing Alice like she was a cockroach that had wandered into a five-star restaurant. "You can't be serious about this." Ethan sighed dramatically, rubbing his temple. "Oh, Richard. Always the optimist." Richard's jaw tightened. "She's unqualified. She doesn't understand the dynamics of this company. Ethan cut him off with a lazy wave of his hand. "And yet, she handled the system crash better than half our IT department." Alice straightened her spine. She wasn't about to let some grumpy executive dismiss her like that. "I may be new," she said firmly, looking Richard in the eye, "but I can learn. Fast." Richard huffed, unimpressed. "We'll see about that." Ethan clapped his hands together. "Well then, Miss Carter, congratulations. You're my new executive assistant, effective immediately." Alice swallowed hard. She had come here expecting to be fired. Instead, she was now working directly under one of the most powerful CEOs in the country. And for some reason, she had the sinking feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger than she had ever anticipated. Alice Carter had never been the center of office gossip before. But now she was the hottest topic at Sterling Enterprises. It had only been a few hours since Ethan Sterling had announced her unexpected promotion. But the news had already spread like wildfire. Every time she walked past a department, the whispers followed her like shadows. "Did you hear? She went from newbie to personal assistant in one day. I bet she's sleeping with him." Alice gritted her teeth, ignoring the looks, the hushed voices, the way people seemed to judge her with their eyes. She had worked too hard to let office gossip rattle her. She had earned this, hadn't she? And yet, why did it feel like she had just stepped into a lion's den? Alice had never been in this part of the building before. It was quieter, more intimidating, and completely different from the bustling lower floors. The walls were lined with sleek glass offices, each belonging to high-ranking executives, who probably made more in a month than she did in a year. And at the center of it all, Ethan Sterling's domain. Alice took a deep breath and pushed open the heavy glass doors to his office. The space was massive, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking San Francisco's skyline, minimalist furniture, and a desk that looked more expensive than her entire apartment. Ethan was already inside, standing near the window, phone in hand. "Sell the stocks before the end of the day," he was saying, If they hesitate, remind them who they're dealing with. Alice shivered. The man had two modes, smug and playful, like when he had tricked her into believing he was it, cold and ruthless, like right now. He finally ended the call and turned to her. "Miss Carter," he said smoothly. "Enjoying the office gossip?" Alice's jaw tightened. "It's hard to miss." Ethan smirked. "Welcome to Sterling Enterprises. People love a scandal more than they love their paychecks." Alice folded her arms. "I didn't ask for a scandal." Ethan chuckled, moving closer. "You didn't have to. The moment I promoted you, people started writing their own narratives." Alice exhaled slowly. "Let me guess. They think I'm sleeping with you." Ethan grinned. "Well, are you?" Alice's eyes widened. "Excuse me?" Ethan laughed. "Relax, Miss Carter. I'm joking. But yes, that's what they think. And they'll keep thinking it until you prove them wrong." Alice stiffened. "And how exactly do I do that?" Ethan leaned against his desk, watching her with those piercing blue eyes. "You show them you're indispensable," he said, "which is why I have a job for you." Alice straightened her spine. "I'm listening." Ethan smirked. "Good, because your first task starts now." Alice followed Ethan out of his office, past the curious stares of executives, and into the conference room. Inside, a dozen senior executives sat around a sleek black table. The tension was thick, the kind that only came when millions of dollars were at stake. At the head of the table, Lauren Brooks. Alice had already heard of her, brilliant, powerful, and Ethan's most trusted senior executive. Lauren was the kind of woman who could walk into a boardroom and make CEOs sweat. And the way she was looking at Alice right now, pure disdain. Ethan clapped his hands. "All right, let's make this quick. We have a situation." He tossed a file onto the table. Alice glanced at the papers. "A charity gala proposal?" Lauren crossed her arms. "We lost the venue." Ethan nodded. "The event is in 3 days, and we need a new location, and new catering, and new security." Alice frowned. 3 days? That's impossible." Ethan's gaze hardened. "Then I guess you better get started." Alice blinked. "Wait. What?" Lauren smirked, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Oh, didn't Ethan tell you? This is your responsibility now." Alice's stomach dropped. They were giving her a task designed to make her fail. And if she failed, she'd be humiliated in front of the entire company. Ethan gave her a measured look, as if he was waiting to see what she'd do. Alice clenched her fists. Fine. If they wanted to see her fail, she'd do the exact opposite. She grabbed the file, squared her shoulders, and met Ethan's eyes. "Consider it done." A ghost of a smile touched Ethan's lips. "Good." Lauren wasn't going to make this easy. As soon as Alice left the conference room, she followed, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "A word of advice," Lauren said, her tone sharp. Alice glanced at her. "Oh, and what's that?" Lauren's red lips curled. "Ethan Sterling goes through assistants faster than I go through designer heels. Don't get too comfortable." Alice smirked. "Funny. I was about to tell you the same thing." Lauren's eyes flashed, but before she could respond, Alice walked away. She had a gala to plan, and she was going to make damn sure she didn't fail. Alice Carter had never felt pressure like this before. She had 72 hours to pull off an event that normally took months to organize. No venue, no catering, no guest confirmations. And if she failed, it wouldn't just be a disaster. It would be her career-ending humiliation. Alice gritted her teeth as she rushed through the bustling office, clutching the thick event file in her arms. Failure was not an option. She just had to figure out how the hell she was going to do this. By the time Alice reached her desk, The whispers had started again. She's doomed. There's no way she can pull this off. I heard Lauren made sure she got the worst task. Alice ignored them all. Instead, she sat down, opened the event file, and started making calls. First, she called every high-end venue in San Francisco. All booked. Then she tried the 5-star hotels. Not a single one available. She even considered outdoor spaces, but the logistics were a nightmare. With every rejection, Alice felt her chances of success slipping through her fingers. And she knew exactly what was happening. Lauren Brooks had set her up to fail. Well, too bad for her. Alice didn't go down without a fight. Just as she was about to lose hope, Alice's phone buzzed. It was Margaret Hastings, an event planner she had worked with years ago. I heard about your dilemma, Margaret said. I might have a solution? Alice's heart pounded. Tell me. Margaret chuckled. It's risky, but there's an exclusive estate in Napa Valley. Gorgeous property. The owner is a bit of a wild card, but if you can convince him, the place is yours. Alice scribbled down the details. Send me the address. I'm on my way. She didn't care if it was risky. It was the only chance she had. 2 hours later, Alice was speeding down the highway toward Napa Valley, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. By the time she arrived at the estate, she was breathless. The place was stunning, an old-world mansion with sprawling gardens, a glass-ceiling ballroom, and a breathtaking view of the vineyards. It was perfect if she could just convince the owner. The problem? The owner was Maxwell Donovan, a billionaire recluse known for turning down everyone who asked to rent his estate. Alice took a deep breath and rang the bell. A moment later, an older man with piercing gray eyes answered. You have 5 minutes to convince me, Maxwell said. Alice exhaled sharply. Here goes nothing. Alice didn't waste time. She laid out her case, detailing the charity's mission, the prestige of the event, and the exclusive guest list. Maxwell listened silently, his expression unreadable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he smirked. I don't rent out my estate, he said. Alice's heart sank. But, he continued, I do like bold people. You remind me of myself when I was younger. He handed her a set of keys. You have one night. Don't mess it up. Alice barely contained her excitement. Thank you, she breathed. Now all she had to do was make sure the event actually happened. By the time Alice returned to the office, she was exhausted but determined. She immediately called vendors, decorators, and catering teams, working through the night to pull everything together. But just when things started falling into place, everything went wrong. The catering company canceled last minute. The VIP invitations were accidentally deleted from the system. The security team claimed they never received their contract. Alice's stomach twisted. She knew exactly who was behind this, Lauren Brooks, and she was running out of time. Alice refused to let this break her. She hired a Michelin star chef last minute. She personally resent every VIP invite. She pulled in extra security from an agency Ethan worked with before. By the time the event started, everything was in place. The ballroom was stunning. Golden chandeliers, elegant floral arrangements, and soft jazz playing in the background. And as the guests started arriving, murmuring about how flawless everything was, Alice finally let out a breath of relief. She had done it. Ethan Sterling arrived late, as always. He walked in, surveyed the event, and then found Alice in the crowd. He didn't smile. He didn't offer praise. Instead, he simply said, "Acceptable." Alice stared at him. "Acceptable?" she repeated, disbelief in her voice. Ethan took a sip of his drink. "You want a medal?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Alice's hands clenched. After everything she had gone through, That was all he had to say. Ethan smirked at her expression. "If you want validation, Miss Carter," he said, "you're in the wrong job." And with that, he walked away. Alice wanted to scream. Instead, she turned and grabbed a glass of champagne. Fine. If that's how he wanted to play it. She was just getting started. Alice Carter had barely recovered from the chaos of the gala when another storm was brewing. This time, it wasn't about venues or vendors. It was about war. And the battlefield? Sterling Enterprises. It started on a Monday morning. Alice was in the middle of organizing Ethan's schedule when the entire office went silent. She looked up, only to see David Lancaster walking through the doors. Tall, sharp-dressed, exuding dangerous charisma. David Lancaster wasn't just any rival CEO. He was Sterling Enterprises' biggest competitor. And he had one goal: to take down Ethan Sterling. Ethan was already waiting in the boardroom, seated at the head of the table. When David walked in, he didn't sit. He leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. "Ethan." Ethan didn't even look up. "David." Alice could feel the tension crackling in the air. She wasn't supposed to be here. This was way above her pay grade. But Ethan had insisted she stay. So she stood to the side, watching, absorbing. The game had begun. David's voice was smooth. "I hear you're expanding into the European market." Ethan finally looked up, so his face unreadable. "News travels fast." David smiled. "Let's just say, I have connections." Alice's stomach tightened. There was something off about this. David Lancaster wasn't here for small talk. He was here to bait Ethan into a mistake. As the conversation continued, Alice's mind worked at lightning speed. She picked up on the subtext, the coded threats, the way David was pushing Ethan toward a deal that sounded good, but had dangerous loopholes. Most people would have missed it. But Alice saw the trap, and she did something unthinkable. She cut in Mr. Lancaster. She said, her voice clear and firm. "That clause you just suggested, if I'm not mistaken, it would technically give your firm ownership over a portion of Sterling Enterprises' European market share." The entire room fell silent. David stared at her, surprised. "Ethan?" For the first time, he actually looked impressed. David leaned back, his expression shifting from amusement to curiosity. "Well," he said slowly, his gaze still locked on Alice. "You're sharp." Alice forced herself not to fidget. Ethan finally spoke. "She is," he said. "And she's also correct." He turned to Alice. "Cancel my next meeting," he said. "We're finishing this now." Alice nodded, hiding her satisfaction. Because in this moment, she knew. She had just proven herself in a world where no one expected her to win. Alice had just barely caught her breath from the battle with David Lancaster when the next unexpected twist came. A dinner invitation from Ethan Sterling. And that terrified her more than any corporate negotiation ever could. It was 7 p.m. when Alice finally shut her laptop, exhausted. She had just finished reviewing contracts when her phone buzzed. A message from Ethan. "Be ready in 20 minutes. I'm picking you up." Alice frowned. Be ready for what? She was about to text back and ask, but another message came through. "Wear something decent. This is a business dinner, not a college reunion." Her jaw dropped. What the hell? She almost ignored him. Almost, but something inside her, maybe curiosity, maybe stupidity, made her grab her coat and rush home to change. Ethan picked her up in a sleek black Aston Martin. Alice hated how effortlessly cool he looked, like he had just walked out of a billion-dollar negotiation and straight into a GQ photo shoot. "You're late," he said as she got in. Alice glared at him. "You gave me 20 minutes. That's not an invitation. That's a military operation." Ethan smirked, but didn't argue. Instead, He pulled onto the road, driving through the city lights in comfortable silence. That's when it hit Alice. This wasn't just dinner. This was something else, and she wasn't sure she wanted to know what. When they arrived, Alice immediately felt out of place. The restaurant was luxurious, the kind of place where a glass of wine cost more than her monthly grocery bill. The host greeted Ethan by name. "Your usual table, Mr. Sterling?" Alice raised an eyebrow. "Your usual table. You bring all your assistants here." Ethan chuckled, leading her to a private table in the back. "No," he said simply. "Just you." Her stomach flipped, but she refused to react. She wouldn't let Ethan Sterling play his psychological games on her. Not tonight. Alice expected boring contract discussions. Instead, Ethan spent the first 20 minutes watching her. No business talk, no strategy, just watching her. It was infuriating. "What?" she finally snapped, setting down her wine glass. Ethan smirked. "You're different than I expected." Alice narrowed her eyes. "And how exactly did you expect me to be?" Ethan leaned forward, his voice lower. "Easily intimidated?" Alice felt a slow burn in her chest. "You don't know me very well, then." Ethan took a sip of his drink, smiling slightly. "No, Alice Carter, I don't." And for some reason, that both thrilled and terrified her. At the same time, halfway through dinner, the real bomb dropped. As Alice was finishing her steak, someone approached their table. She looked up. David Lancaster. Great, just great. David slid into the empty chair across from Ethan, ignoring the glares from the waiters. "Ethan," he greeted smoothly, then turned to Alice. "And you, Miss Carter. Always a pleasure." Alice set her fork down. "What do you want, Lancaster?" David chuckled. "Just dropping by to say something important." He leaned in, his voice dropping. "Ethan isn't who you think he is." Alice froze. Ethan didn't react. He just sat back, his face unreadable. David continued, his eyes locked onto Alice's. "Be careful, Miss Carter. When you play with fire, you don't always see the burn until it's too late." Then, with a satisfied smile, he stood up and walked away. Alice's chest tightened. What the hell did that mean? And why? When she looked back at Ethan, did he look like someone who was hiding a very dangerous secret? The ride back was silent. Ethan's hands gripped the wheel a little tighter than usual. Alice finally turned to him. What did David mean? Ethan's jaw clenched. Nothing. Alice scoffed. Oh, right. Because rival CEOs just drop by fancy restaurants to give random warnings for no reason. Ethan said nothing. Alice pushed harder. Ethan, if there's something I should know. Ethan suddenly pulled the car over. Alice's breath hitched as he turned to her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought he was going to kiss her. Instead, he just looked at her, as if debating something. Then he said quietly, "Some things are better left unknown, Alice." Then he started the car again. And Alice knew. This was only the beginning. The next morning, Alice woke up to chaos. Her phone was blowing up with messages, calls from colleagues, texts from unknown numbers, and the worst part, her name and photo were plastered all over the internet. Alice stared in horror at the headlines. Billionaire CEO caught in scandalous affair with assistant. Ethan Sterling's secret love life exposed. Office romance or corporate manipulation. Attached to the articles were doctored photos of her and Ethan. Pictures taken from completely unrelated moments, meetings, walking out of the office together, sitting next to each other at the charity gala. Now edited to look like intimate moments. Alice felt her stomach drop. Her career was over. Her life was over. And she had no idea who did this, but she had a strong suspicion. Storming into the office, Alice ignored the stares and whispers as she made a beeline for Lauren's desk. The moment she saw the smug smirk on Lauren's face, she knew. "You did this," Alice hissed, slamming a newspaper onto Lauren's desk. Lauren didn't even flinch. She just leaned back in her chair, twirling a pen between her fingers. "Careful, Carter," she said smoothly. "Accusations like that can get you into trouble." Alice's blood boiled. "You leaked fake stories about me and Ethan just because you what? Didn't like that I got the promotion instead of you?" Lauren's eyes flashed. "Oh, sweetheart," she cooed mockingly. "This isn't just about you. It's about balance." Alice gritted her teeth. "Balance?" Lauren leaned forward, her voice dropping into a whisper. "Ethan Sterling never keeps an assistant for long, and I'm making sure you're not the exception." Alice's hands clenched into fists, but before she could respond, a deep voice cut through the tension. "What the hell is going on here?" Ethan stood at the entrance of the office, his gaze cold and unreadable. Every single employee froze. Alice turned to him, heart pounding. "Step into my office, now." The entire floor watched in silence as Alice followed Ethan into his office. The moment the door shut, she exploded. "This is insane. I don't even know how to fix this." Ethan held up a hand. "Sit." Alice hesitated, then dropped into the chair across from him. Ethan leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "You think I care about what some tabloids say?" Alice blinked. Yes. Because this is your reputation too?" Ethan shrugged. "My reputation can handle it." Alice let out a frustrated laugh. "Well, mine can't. I worked my whole life to build credibility, and now I'm just Sterling's side piece to the entire world." Ethan's jaw tensed slightly, but instead of responding to that, he said something completely unexpected. "Do you trust me?" Alice froze. That was a dangerous question. Because did she? Did she trust Ethan Sterling? Before she could answer, he pushed a folder across the desk. "Sign this." Alice hesitated. Then she opened the folder, and her entire body went cold. It was a lawsuit, filed against the tabloids, for defamation, libel, and invasion of privacy. Alice's mouth went dry. "You're suing them?" Ethan nodded. "But she swallowed. "That's a huge risk." Ethan didn't blink. "They want a scandal? I'll give them one. But on my terms." Alice's heart pounded. She wasn't sure if this was brilliant or insane. But it was Ethan Sterling, and he never did anything without a plan. She picked up the pen and signed. The next 48 hours were a media firestorm. The lawsuit became bigger news than the fake affair. Some media outlets rushed to retract their stories. Others doubled down, trying to dig up more dirt. Investors were divided, some applauding Ethan's boldness, others questioning his judgment. But the biggest shocker? Lauren Brooks. Because just as Alice was starting to think she might actually survive this, Lauren struck again. And this time she wasn't just playing dirty. She was out for blood. 48 hours later, Alice Carter was done. She had endured whispers in the office, reporters lurking outside her apartment, and a constant flood of online harassment. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared her for the final blow. A termination notice, not hers, Ethan's. She stood frozen outside Ethan's office, clutching the email in her hand. Effective immediately, Ethan Sterling is removed. As CEO of Sterling Enterprises, the board has voted unanimously in favor of his termination. Interim CEO will be announced soon. Alice felt her chest tighten. This couldn't be happening. Not after everything he had built. Not because of her. The door to Ethan's office was slightly open. She pushed it gently, stepping inside. Ethan sat at his desk, staring out the window, his usual sharp presence eerily still. The city skyline reflected in the glass. He didn't even turn around. "They voted," he said quietly. Alice's grip on the email tightened. "They didn't even warn you." Ethan let out a dry chuckle. "Oh, they warned me, just not in words." Alice took a shaky breath. I don't understand. How can they just... They own more shares than I do." He finally turned to face her, expression unreadable. "And a CEO involved in a scandal is bad for business." Alice's stomach sank. "So, they're punishing you for defending me?" Ethan shrugged. "It was bound to happen eventually." His voice was calm, too calm. That's when Alice realized he had seen this coming. A surge of anger and guilt twisted in Alice's chest. He had risked everything for her, and now he had lost everything because of her. "This is my fault," she whispered. Ethan frowned. "Don't do that. I should have never taken this job." "Stop." Her voice shook. "You lost your company because of me." Ethan exhaled, standing up. Then, to her complete shock, he walked around the desk and gently grabbed her wrist. Alice's breath hitched. "You listen to me," he said, voice low. "You didn't do this. I made my own decisions." Alice met his gaze, and for the first time she saw something she had never seen in Ethan Sterling before. Raw exhaustion. He was tired, not just physically, tired of fighting alone. Alice felt her heart clench. She had always thought of him as invincible, but right now, he wasn't. Alice pulled back, swallowing hard. She couldn't do this anymore. She had to leave. I think I should go." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I mean it," she whispered. "I can't be the reason you lose everything." Silence. Then he said something that broke her completely. "If you leave now, you'll regret it." Alice's throat closed up, but she couldn't stay. Not after everything. So she turned and walked out the door. That night, Ethan sat alone in his penthouse, a half-empty glass of scotch on the table. The city stretched out beneath him, bright, loud, chaotic. But inside his apartment, everything was silent. Too silent. His mind replayed the past few weeks. Alice, the only person who had ever challenged him, the only person who had made him feel something real. And now, she was gone. He should have stopped her. He should have told her the truth. But it was too late. He had lost her, or at least, that's what he thought. Alice Carter had spent the past 2 weeks trying to convince herself she had made the right choice. Leaving Ethan, leaving Sterling Enterprises, leaving behind the most complicated, frustrating, and intoxicating relationship of her life. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt empty. Alice had started working at a small consulting firm in San Francisco, a job with no scandals, no billionaire bosses, no life-threatening drama. And yet, she hated it. Every morning, she instinctively reached for her phone, expecting to see a message from Ethan. But there was nothing. He hadn't called, hadn't texted, hadn't fought for her. And that hurt the most. Meanwhile, Ethan Sterling had disappeared. Since his forced resignation, he had avoided the press, declined interviews, and refused to make a statement. The city's most ruthless billionaire had gone silent. No one knew where he was. No one, except one person, Richard Blake. Alice's day at her new job was mind-numbingly uneventful until she saw him, Richard, standing in the reception area, looking like he owned the place. Alice's stomach dropped. "What are you doing here?" she asked, crossing her arms. Richard smirked. "Boss wants to see you." Alice blinked. "Boss?" "Ethan." Her pulse spiked. She wanted to say no, wanted to pretend she was completely over him. But instead, She found herself following Richard out the door. Ethan's penthouse was exactly as she remembered it, except for one thing. Ethan himself. He looked different, darker, colder, like a man who had lost everything and wasn't sure how to get it back. Alice's chest tightened. "You finally crawled out of your cave," she said, trying to keep her voice even. Ethan stared at her for a long moment. Then, in a voice lower than she remembered, he said, "I never wanted you to leave." Alice's breath hitched. He had never been this direct before. She felt 1,000 emotions crash into her at once. Anger, confusion, longing. "You didn't stop me," she whispered. Ethan's jaw tensed. "I thought it was what you wanted." Alice laughed bitterly. "You really don't get it, do you?" Ethan took a step closer. "I didn't stop you because I didn't want to trap you in a life where you had to keep fighting for me." Alice's heart pounded. She should have left right then. She should have walked away. But instead, she kissed him. The kiss was slow at first, tentative, like they were testing the waters, seeing if this was still real. Then, Ethan's hand tangled in her hair. Alice melted into him, every ounce of logic vanishing. It wasn't just passion. It was relief, like they had been drowning without each other. But when they finally pulled away, Alice whispered the one thing she knew was true. "This is dangerous." Ethan smirked. "Then let's keep it a secret." The next few weeks were a blur of stolen moments, secret meetings in luxury hotels, late-night phone calls, hidden glances whenever they crossed paths in public. But the more they tried to keep it quiet, the more dangerous it became, because sooner or later, someone was going to find out. Alice had always known the risks. Keeping a secret relationship with one of the most powerful men in the city was never going to be easy. But she had fooled herself into thinking they could keep it hidden, that as long as they were careful, as long as they avoided suspicion, no one would find out. She had never been more wrong. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a text. "Lauren Brooks. Nice try, sweetheart. But secrets never stay buried." Alice's blood ran cold. Lauren knew. And if she knew, it was only a matter of time before the rest of the world did too. The next morning, Sterling Enterprises was in chaos. The front page of every major business and gossip magazine was the same. Ethan Sterling's secret affair, with ex-assistant exposed. A photo of Alice leaving Ethan's penthouse was plastered everywhere. The headline wasn't just bad. It was a death sentence. Because it wasn't just about the scandal. It was about the timing. Ethan was in the middle of fighting to reclaim his company. A scandal like this, it gave his enemies exactly what they needed to destroy him. And Alice, she was the perfect scapegoat. Within hours, Ethan's phone exploded with calls. By noon, he was sitting in a boardroom, staring at a line of furious executives. "We have a problem," one of them said, tossing a magazine onto the table. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "We?" The room went dead silent. Then, Richard Blake cleared his throat. "The board is prepared to back your return to the company," Richard said carefully. "But this relationship? It's a liability." Ethan's eyes narrowed. A different executive spoke up. "If you want to regain control of Sterling Enterprises, you need to cut ties." Ethan went rigid. "Cut ties?" he repeated. They didn't hesitate. Yes. The message was clear. If he wanted to save his empire, he had to let Alice go. While Ethan was being ambushed by the board, Alice was facing her own battle. Her new company had called her in for a private discussion. She barely had time to sit down before the CEO slid a non-disclosure agreement across the table. "This is a formality," the CEO said, forcing a polite smile. Given the unfortunate circumstances, Alice's stomach dropped. You're firing me, she realized. The CEO sighed. You're talented, Alice, he said. But right now, you're radioactive. Alice felt sick. Her past followed her. No matter where she went, no matter how hard she tried to escape, Alice had always known she would never fit into Ethan's world, but she had never imagined it would be like this. That night, she went to Ethan's penthouse. Not to seek comfort, but to end it. Ethan was already waiting for her. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept in days. I know why you're here, he said quietly. Alice's throat tightened. She wanted to tell him she was sorry, that she wished things were different, but all she could say was, "This isn't going to work." Ethan stiffened. "That's not your decision to make," he said, his voice sharp. Alice's heart ached. "This is bigger than us, Ethan." His jaw locked. "You're giving up." Alice swallowed the lump in her throat. "I'm walking away." Ethan's expression darkened. "Alice." But she was already turning away, already walking to the door, already forcing herself not to look back. Because if she did, she might never leave. The next day, Ethan did what no one expected. He held a press conference. Standing before dozens of reporters, he delivered a statement, one that changed everything. "There has been a lot of speculation about my personal life," he said, his voice calm, controlled. "Yes, I was in a relationship with Alice Carter. Yes, I care about her deeply. No, she did not manipulate, coerce, or use me to gain power." He looked directly into the cameras. "But if my relationship is a threat to my position..." He took a deep breath. "Then, I renounce my claim to the company." Gasps rippled through the crowd. But Ethan wasn't finished. "Sterling Enterprises was built on power and control," he continued. "But I refuse to let it dictate my life any longer." Then, without another word, he walked away. From the press, from the company, from everything. The world exploded. Ethan's enemies thought they had won, that he had finally been destroyed. But what they didn't realize was that Ethan Sterling had never needed a throne to be powerful, because true power was about knowing when to walk away. And this time, he was walking toward something else, something more important. Ethan Sterling had never been a man to surrender, and he wasn't about to start now. Not when everything he loved was slipping through his fingers. Not when the world thought he had lost. Not when Alice Carter was still out there, alone, unprotected, and suffering the consequences of his choices. If the world wanted a fight, then Ethan was ready to give them one. Walking away from Sterling Enterprises had been the easy part. What followed was a war. Within hours of his resignation, the company's stock plummeted. Headlines exploded across every major news outlet. "Ethan Sterling abandons throne. Is this the end of the empire?" Sterling Enterprises in crisis. CEO walks away over scandal. Billionaire love story or career suicide. Investors panicked. The board was scrambling, and Ethan was watching from the sidelines, completely unbothered. Because while the world saw a man who had lost everything, Ethan knew the truth. He hadn't lost. Not yet. Because Sterling Enterprises wasn't the only thing he built, and his real power had never come from the company. It came from his mind, his vision, and most importantly, his ability to rebuild. The moment Ethan walked out of that press conference, he knew what he had to do. Step 1. Regain control of the narrative. He picked up the phone and called Sophia Grant, one of the top crisis PR strategists in the country. She answered on the first ring. "So," she said, voice smooth and amused, "you finally decided to call me." Ethan's tone was flat. "I need to burn the board to the ground." Sophia laughed. Oh, honey, you're going to need more than a match for that. While Ethan was strategizing, Sterling Enterprises was imploding. Richard Blake, the acting CEO, was struggling to contain the chaos. The company's biggest investors were furious. They had bet billions on Ethan's leadership. Now, their money was at risk. Their confidence was shattered. And Richard? He was desperate, so desperate, that he called Ethan. Ethan let the phone ring twice before answering. "Sterling," he said casually. Richard's voice was tense. "You need to come back." Ethan smirked. "Do I?" "We can negotiate. Name your terms." Ethan leaned back in his chair. There it was, the moment he had been waiting for. Ethan's terms were simple. 1. Richard Blake resigns immediately. 2. Half the board steps down and is replaced by Ethan's hand-picked executives. 3. Alice Carter is publicly cleared of any wrongdoing and given a public apology from the company. Richard choked. "You're out of your mind." Ethan chuckled. "Am I?" "Sterling Enterprises will collapse if you don't return." Ethan cut him off. "Then, let it collapse." A heavy silence filled the air, because Richard knew the truth. Without Ethan, Sterling Enterprises wouldn't survive. And Ethan? Ethan didn't need the company. The company needed him. Alice had tried to stay out of it. After the breakup, she had focused on rebuilding her life. Getting a new job, moving into a small but cozy apartment, and trying, really trying, to forget Ethan Sterling. But it was impossible. Every headline was about him. Every news station was dissecting his every move, and every part of her heart still ached for him. Then, one day, she got a call from Sophia Grant. "Alice," Sophia said, tone serious, "Ethan's fighting for you." Alice's heart stopped. "What?" "He's demanding the company clear your name, publicly, officially, no negotiation." Alice's stomach twisted. She had never asked him to do this. She had never expected him to fight. But he was, and the whole world was watching. 3 days later, Sterling Enterprises held a press conference. Richard Blake stood in front of dozens of cameras, looking miserable. And then, he said the words Alice never thought she'd hear. The allegations against Alice Carter were false. She was unfairly scrutinized and unfairly treated. On behalf of Sterling Enterprises, we offer a formal apology. Additionally, the board of directors has approved Ethan Sterling's return as CEO. Alice felt lightheaded. He had done it. Ethan had won. Alice wasn't sure if she should go, if she should see him again. But when she walked into Sterling Enterprises that night, Ethan was already waiting for her. He looked exhausted, like he had fought an entire war and barely made it out alive. "You shouldn't be here," he said, voice gravelly. Alice's heart pounded. "Neither should you." Ethan let out a rough laugh. They stood there, silent, caught in the storm of everything they had been through. Then, Ethan took a step closer, and then another, and another, until he was so close that Alice could feel the warmth of his breath against her skin. "Tell me to stop," he murmured. Alice swallowed hard. "I can't." And just like that, he kissed her, hard, desperate, like he was drowning, and she was the only thing keeping him alive. And for the first time in months, Alice let herself fall, because this was where she belonged, in his arms, in his world, no matter the cost. The night air was crisp against Alice's skin as she stood on the rooftop of Sterling Enterprises. San Francisco stretched out before her, a sea of glittering lights blinking against the darkness. And standing across from her, Ethan Sterling, the man who had risked everything for her, the man who had fought the world to clear her name, the man she had tried to walk away from. but never could. Now, there was something in his eyes, something dangerous, something certain. And as he took a step closer, Alice's heart pounded in her chest, because she knew what was about to happen. And she wasn't ready. Not for this. Not for him. Not for the words that would change her life forever. Ethan took a deep breath. Then, he dropped to one knee. Alice froze. Time slowed. Her brain couldn't process what was happening. But then, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring so breathtakingly simple that Alice felt her chest tighten. Because it wasn't about the diamond. It wasn't about the money. It was about him. About them. About everything they had fought for. Ethan's voice was rough, edged with an emotion Alice had never heard before. Alice Carter. She sucked in a breath. He held her gaze, steady, unwavering, raw. I lost you once. His jaw tightened. I'm not losing you again. Alice felt dizzy. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. But Ethan just kept going. I love you. Alice stared at him, completely shattered by those words. 3 words she never thought she'd hear from him. 3 words she had ached for, but never dared to hope for. Ethan let out a harsh breath. I should have said it sooner. I should have fought harder. I should have... His voice broke. He looked up at her, his eyes blazing. But I'm saying it now. And I'm fighting now. And I'm never stopping. Alice couldn't breathe. Ethan swallowed hard. Marry me. Alice's world tilted. Her pulse roared in her ears. Her hands shook. And for the first time in her entire life, she had no idea what to say. Images flashed through Alice's mind. Her first disastrous day at Sterling Enterprises. The impossible challenges Ethan threw at her. The scandal, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the moment he let her go, the moment he fought to get her back. They had been through hell together, and somehow, they had survived. Together. Alice's hands were shaking. Her mind was spinning. But when she finally looked at him, she knew the answer. Because deep down, she had always known. A slow, soft smile curved her lips, and she whispered, yes. Ethan exhaled sharply. Then, before she could even process what was happening, he was on his feet, and his mouth was on hers, and the world melted away. Because this was home, and it always had been. By the next morning, the world had lost its mind. Ethan Sterling engaged to his former secretary, Alice Carter, from executive assistant to future CEO's wife. The love story that shocked the corporate world. Reporters were camped outside their apartment. Social media was exploding, and Alice was just trying to process the fact that she was engaged to Ethan Sterling, to the most infuriating, brilliant, impossible man she had ever met. And the most dangerous part? She wouldn't change a thing, because for the first time in her life, she had found where she belonged. Alice Carter had always been a fighter. She had fought for her job. She had fought for her dignity. She had fought for Ethan Sterling, whether she wanted to or not. But this was a different kind of battle. Because walking down the aisle meant walking into a future she couldn't predict. And for the first time in her life, Alice Carter was terrified. Date, June 18th. Location, a private estate in Napa Valley. Guest list, the elite of the business world. The ceremony was set to be perfect. A picture-perfect venue. The most expensive floral arrangements money could buy. An exclusive guest list filled with CEOs, politicians, and celebrities. And at the center of it all, Alice Carter, the former executive assistant turned soon-to-be wife of Ethan Sterling, a woman the world wasn't sure how to feel about. And that was the problem, because as Alice sat in front of the massive vanity mirror, staring at her reflection, She could hear the whispers. She's just a secretary. What does she know about being the wife of a billionaire? Ethan Sterling could have any woman in the world. Why her? This marriage is going to end in disaster. Watch. Alice's hands tightened into fists, because no matter how far she had come, no matter how much she had proven herself, the world still saw her as the girl who didn't belong. And that hurt. Ethan found her before the ceremony, and the moment he stepped into the room, Alice felt it, that electric pull between them, the connection that had survived every scandal, every betrayal, every storm. He stood behind her, his reflection towering over hers in the mirror. Then, in a voice as deep as sin, he murmured, "Say the word, Alice, and we walk away from all of this." Alice froze. Ethan's expression was unreadable, but his eyes held the truth. He knew she was scared. He knew she had doubts, and he was willing to burn the world down if she needed him to. Alice turned in her seat, looking up at him, and for the first time since the proposal, she saw it. The fear behind his confidence, the vulnerability beneath his arrogance, because Ethan Sterling, the untouchable billionaire, was just as terrified of losing her as she was of losing herself. So she took a breath and whispered, "I'm not going anywhere." Ethan's jaw clenched, and in the next second, he kissed her, hard, desperate, like a man who knew he had just been saved. When Alice walked down the aisle, the world held its breath. But she only saw him. And when Ethan took her hands at the altar, his grip was firm, unshakable. And then he spoke. Ethan Sterling's vows. "I've built empires, broken rivals, controlled industries. But you're the first thing I've never been able to control. And I don't want to. Because you, Alice Carter, are the only thing that has ever made me believe in something more than power. And today, I choose you. Every day I will choose you." Alice's throat tightened, and when she spoke, her voice was shaky, but strong. "You once told me that power is everything. But you're wrong. It's not power. It's not wealth. It's not reputation. It's love. It's the way you fought for me when no one else did. It's the way you see me, not as your assistant, not as some Cinderella story, but as the woman who can stand beside you. And today I choose you. Every day I will choose you." Silence. Then applause, cheers, a kiss that shook the world. And just like that, Alice Carter became Mrs. Ethan Sterling. The reception was chaotic, flashing cameras, reporters everywhere. The wedding had barely ended, and already the media was tearing it apart. The billionaire and the secretary, a marriage that won't last, a power move or a love story. Alice Carter, the most hated woman in corporate America. But Ethan didn't care, because the real war was about to begin, because in the shadows, a new enemy was waiting. The wedding was over, but the real war was only just beginning. Alice Sterling, formerly Alice Carter, the executive assistant nobody took seriously, was now the most talked about woman in the country, and not in a good way. Tabloids called her a gold digger. Business insiders called her a liability. Rival CEOs saw her as Ethan's greatest weakness. And worst of all, Sterling Enterprises board saw her as a threat. Alice had fought for Ethan's love. Now she had to fight for their future. And this time, the enemy wasn't just the media. It was everyone. Monday morning headlines. The secretary who stole a billionaire. Inside Alice Sterling's manipulation tactics. Ethan Sterling's biggest mistake. His new wife. Marriage or business play. What Alice stands to gain. Alice sat at the breakfast table in Ethan's penthouse, staring at the front page of a newspaper. The headlines screamed at her, and her stomach twisted. She was used to being underestimated, used to the whispers, the stares. But this was a full-scale attack. The media was painting her as a scheming social climber who had manipulated her way into Ethan's life. Every mistake she had ever made, every job she had ever lost, was being dragged into the spotlight. And worst of all, Sterling Enterprises' board was using it against her. Because while the media played its games, the real battle was happening inside the company walls. Ethan stormed into the boardroom, his presence commanding. 12 of the most powerful men in corporate America sat before him, their expressions cold. At the head of the table, Richard Blake, Ethan's longtime executive, a man who had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now, he had it. Richard Blake. Ethan, we've always supported your decisions, but this marriage is a PR disaster. Investors are concerned, clients are watching, and we have to ask. Ethan Sterling. Ask what? Richard Blake. Whether you're still fit to lead this company. Silence. Tension so thick, you could cut it with a knife. Ethan's jaw tightened. They were trying to push him out, using Alice as the reason. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Sterling realized he might actually lose. Alice stood outside the boardroom, her heart pounding. She had seen the looks people gave her. She had heard the whispers about how she was ruining Ethan. And she had a choice: run or fight. So she steeled herself, pushed open the door, and walked straight into the lion's den. The board froze as she entered. Ethan's eyes locked onto hers, burning with an unspoken warning. But Alice ignored it. Because if there was one thing she had learned, it was that no one was going to fight for her. She had to fight for herself. So she took a seat, folded her hands, and in a voice calm, steady, and dangerous, she spoke. Alice Sterling, let's cut the theatrics, shall we? You're not worried about Sterling Enterprises. You're worried that I won't be controllable. Silence. The board exchanged uneasy glances. She had their attention. Alice Sterling, you think I'm a liability? Fine. Give me a challenge. Put me through hell. But don't ever. She leaned forward. Ever. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Underestimate me. Boom. Ethan grinned. Because in that moment, Alice Sterling had just declared war. The board adjourned. And as Alice stepped into the hallway, her adrenaline still running high, she felt it. A presence, a shadow. And then, a voice behind her. That was a mistake. Alice turned. Richard Blake. His expression? Cold, calculating, deadly. Richard Blake. You think you're untouchable because Ethan loves you? Alice's heart pounded. Richard Blake. You don't know what you've just walked into. Alice's throat went dry. Because the way he said it, it wasn't a warning. It was a promise. A promise that this wasn't just a corporate battle. This was war. And now, it was personal. The war had begun. But Alice Sterling wasn't backing down. She had faced the board, stood toe-to-toe with Richard Blake, and survived the first attack. Now, it was time to end this. She wasn't just fighting for her place in Ethan's world anymore. She was fighting for Ethan himself, because if she lost, Ethan would lose everything. And Alice refused to let that happen. Monday morning, Sterling Enterprises. Alice walked through the halls, feeling the eyes on her. The whispers, the stares. She was no longer just Ethan's assistant. She was the CEO's wife. The woman who challenged the board. The woman who refused to be erased. And now, she was the biggest threat in the building. But Alice didn't care. She had bigger problems, because today, the board was meeting again. And this time, they weren't just attacking her. They were attacking Ethan. The boardroom was silent. 12 men, 12 votes, and one question: should Ethan Sterling be removed as CEO? Alice sat beside Ethan, her hands clenched under the table. Richard Blake sat across from them, his expression calm, confident, dangerous, because he knew. He had the votes. This wasn't just business anymore. This was revenge, and Alice could see it. Ethan was losing. For the first time, Ethan Sterling was losing. 1 vote, 2 votes, 3 votes against him. Alice's pulse raced. She couldn't let this happen. She wouldn't let this happen. But before she could speak, a voice interrupted. Ethan Sterling. Enough. The room froze. Ethan's chair scraped against the floor as he stood up. His blue eyes burned with a dangerous fire, and in a voice low, lethal, and final, he spoke. Ethan Sterling, you want me gone? Fine. Let's make it interesting. The board stared. Ethan leaned forward, his power radiating. Ethan Sterling, I'll give you a choice. You can vote me out, or you can double your profits in 6 months. Silence. The board hesitated, and Ethan smirked, because he knew they didn't want to fire him. They wanted to control him. And now he had them exactly where he wanted. That night, the Sterling penthouse rooftop. Alice stood on the rooftop, staring out at the San Francisco skyline. The city lights sparkled, but Alice's mind was elsewhere. She had spent months fighting for her place in this world. But tonight, for the first time, she wondered if she really belonged. Was she strong enough to survive this world? To survive being Ethan Sterling's wife? To fight these battles for the rest of her life? She heard footsteps, turned, and there he was, Ethan Sterling, the man who had changed everything. But tonight, he looked different. His suit was gone, his tie loosened, and in his hands, a small black box. Alice's breath caught. She froze as Ethan walked toward her, his blue eyes never leaving hers. And then, he dropped to one knee. Alice's heart stopped, because this wasn't a joke. This wasn't a PR move. This wasn't another battle to win. This was real. Ethan Sterling. Alice Carter. Alice sucked in a breath. You walked into my company and turned my life upside down. She let out a shaky laugh. You challenged me, fought me, and refused to back down. And somehow, his voice softened. Somehow, I fell in love with you. Alice swallowed hard. Her chest ached, and as Ethan opened the ring box, a diamond sparkled under the city lights. Ethan Sterling. Marry me. Silence. Alice's heart pounded, because she had spent her entire life fighting for survival, fighting to prove herself, fighting to be enough. And now someone was choosing her, without hesitation, without doubt, without conditions. Tears burned in her eyes, and in a voice barely above a whisper, she answered. Boom. The world shifted. Alice laughed through her tears as Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger. He stood, pulled her close, and then he kissed her. A kiss that wasn't just a kiss that was a promise that no matter what happened, they would fight together. Because Ethan Sterling hadn't just given her a ring. He had given her the ultimate proof. She wasn't just his wife, she was his equal. And now, it was time to prove it to the world. And just like that, Alice and Ethan's war had only begun. But this time, they weren't fighting alone. They were fighting together. Now I have to ask you, what would you do if you were in Alice's shoes? Would you fight for love, power, and respect? Or would you walk away from a battle that never seems to end? Drop a comment below. I want to hear your thoughts. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Because trust me, the next chapter It's going to change everything. See you soon. Fire Rocket.